In the first decades of the 20th century, William Frederick Halsey Jr. emerged as a naval officer in a world where sea power still meant battleships, imperial competition, and long-distance coalitions. Born in Elizabeth, New Jersey on October 30th, 1882, he entered the United States Naval Academy in 1900 and graduated in 1904, joining a generation of officers whose formative experiences included the voyage of the Great White Fleet and the transition from sail and steam to oil-fired steel navies. The United States, Britain, Japan, and other maritime powers all viewed fleets as instruments for protecting trade routes, colonies, and political influence across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Halsey's early service reflected pre-First World War priorities. He served on battleships and then specialized in torpedo craft, commanding groups of destroyers and torpedo boats tasked with scouting and attacking enemy capital ships. During the First World War, he commanded destroyers escorting convoys in the Atlantic, contributing to efforts to reduce losses to German U-boats. The experience familiarized him with dispersed formations, independent command at sea, and the importance of rapid decision-making under uncertain information. But it still took place within a battleship-centered strategic framework shared by most major navies. The interwar period reshaped that framework. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and subsequent agreements limited the tonnage and armament of battleships and battlecruisers among the United States, Britain, Japan, France, and Italy. These limits pushed planners to explore alternative ways of projecting force within treaty ceilings. The conversion of American battlecruiser hulls into the fleet carriers Lexington and Saratoga, and Japanese conversions such as Akagi and Kaga, symbolized this change. Navies experimented with flight decks, deck parks, and coordinated air groups, while official doctrine still treated aircraft largely as extensions of traditional fleets, rather than independent striking arms. Halsey entered naval aviation relatively late. After assignments as naval attaché and surface ship commander in Europe and at the Naval Academy, he completed aviation training and was designated a naval aviator in 1935. He commanded the carrier Saratoga between 1935 and 1937 and later led carrier divisions in the scouting force, using fleet exercises to test massed carrier strikes, long-range search patterns, and surprise attacks on bases such as Pearl Harbor in peacetime war games. These maneuvers influenced thinking across the officer corps, including those who would later serve in rival commands, and who sometimes drew different conclusions about the vulnerability and potential of carriers. In East Asia, Japanese leaders faced a different but related set of pressures. Military operations in China after 1937 drew Japan into an open-ended continental war that consumed manpower and fuel. To secure oil, bauxite, and rubber, planners in Tokyo looked south toward the Netherlands' East Indies, British Malaya, and American-controlled Philippines. Their naval response was to concentrate carriers, fast escorts, and land-based air into the First Air Fleet, or Kido Butai, designed to deliver large-scale surprise strikes at long range. By late 1941, this formation included 6 fleet carriers and hundreds of embarked aircraft, supported by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, tankers, and submarines. American strategy in the Pacific reflected both global commitments and domestic politics. The United States maintained significant naval forces in the Atlantic, while gradually reinforcing the Pacific Fleet, which by December 1941 included 3 carriers based in the Pacific Theater: Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga. Public opinion in the United States remained divided between isolationist sentiment and support for aid to Britain and China, while embargoes and export controls on oil and other materials increased tensions with Japan. In contrast, many Japanese officers interpreted these measures as evidence that conflict with the United States was becoming difficult to avoid, even as some civilian officials sought negotiated compromises. Within this broader environment, Halsey's own position on the eve of war was the product of interwar promotion and aviation policy. In June 1940, he became commander, aircraft, battle force with the rank of vice admiral, responsible for the main carrier-striking arm of the Pacific Fleet. His flag was soon associated with the carrier Enterprise and the task force built around it, one of the few formations capable of rapid offensive movement across the Central Pacific. Other American commanders, including Chester Nimitz and Raymond Spruance, would later approach operational problems from different backgrounds in submarines or battleships, illustrating the diversity of perspectives within the same Navy. By late 1941, the opposing sides had assembled their fleets, plans, and expectations. Japanese naval aviation could mass more fleet and light carriers in the Pacific than the United States, which in turn relied on industrial capacity, a network of island bases, and cooperation with the British and Dutch. Political leaders in Washington and Tokyo weighed the risks of war under the constraints of public opinion, resource availability, and alliance structures. For officers like Halsey, Nagumo, Nimitz, and Yamamoto, the coming conflict would test not only personal command styles, but also the competing interpretations of how sea power should be used in a carrier age that was still in the process of being defined. When war in the Pacific began in December 1941, Halsey entered it not as an abstract planner, but as a task force commander already at sea. On 28 November 1941, the carrier Enterprise and its escorts left Pearl Harbor to deliver Marine Corps fighter squadrons to Wake Island, carrying F-4F fighters and personnel intended to reinforce the small garrison there. The task force included cruisers and destroyers organized under what would become known as Task Force 8, with Halsey as overall commander and subordinate captains handling individual ships. The formation operated under radio silence and standard peacetime rules, without formal knowledge that diplomatic talks with Japan were nearing collapse. On the morning of December 7, 1941, while Enterprise was returning toward Hawaii, Japanese carrier forces under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo launched several hundred aircraft against Pearl Harbor from a position north of Oahu. The attack damaged or sank multiple American battleships and support vessels, and caused thousands of military and civilian casualties on the island. Enterprise's air group, flying in ahead of the carrier, encountered Japanese aircraft and anti-aircraft fire over Oahu, losing several planes and transmitting the first reports that enemy forces were attacking. For American personnel on the ships at sea and on the ground in Hawaii, the event marked a sudden transition from tense peace to open conflict. For Japanese crews, it represented the execution of an operation planned for months as a means to secure freedom of action in Southeast Asia. In the days immediately after the attack, American command structures in the Pacific were redefined. Admiral Husband Kimmel was relieved as Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet, and replaced by Admiral Chester Nimitz later in December. Halsey continued to command carrier task forces operating from Pearl Harbor, while other senior officers, including Frank Jack Fletcher and Wilson Brown, received their own formations. On the Japanese side, the combined fleet under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto retained operational control over Kido Butai, but individual carrier groups rotated between different operations as the campaign extended from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean. Early missions assigned to Halsey's carriers reflected both the limited number of available American flight decks and the need to demonstrate an ability to strike back. In February 1942, Enterprise and Yorktown spearheaded raids against Japanese bases in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands. Aircraft from these carriers attacked airfields, shipping, and installations on atolls such as Kwajalein, Wotje, and Maloelap. The number of planes involved on each side was modest compared with later battles, but the operations forced Japanese commanders to divert assets to local defense and gave American crews experience with coordinated carrier strikes in wartime conditions. At the same time, the raids carried risks to island civilians and to Japanese military personnel stationed on small garrisons with limited medical and logistical support. Subsequent operations extended the reach of Halsey's task forces. In March, Enterprise aircraft struck Marcus Island, a remote Japanese possession northeast of the Marianas, probing air defenses far from Hawaii. The most politically visible mission came on the 18th of April, 1942, when Halsey commanded Task Force 16, centered on the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, that launched 16 B-25 bombers under Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle against targets in the Tokyo area and other Japanese cities. The bombers inflicted comparatively limited physical damage but had psychological and political consequences. In the United States, the raid was presented as the first direct response to Pearl Harbor. In Japan, it exposed gaps in long-range air defenses and contributed to later decisions about extending the defensive perimeter. These opening months shaped perceptions on all sides about the role of carriers and the nature of the conflict. American planners concluded that carriers, not battleships, were now the primary offensive weapon in the Pacific, and Halsey's task forces became central tools for limited strikes while ground campaigns unfolded in the Philippines, Malaya, and the Netherlands East Indies. Japanese leaders, while continuing large-scale operations on land and at sea, now had to account for the possibility of sudden carrier raids against bases previously considered relatively secure. Civilians in both the United States and Japan encountered air attack on home or colonial territory, reinforcing the sense that the war had become a long-distance contest, in which the movements of a few ships could have direct effects on distant cities. Strategic planning for the Pacific War in 1942 placed Halsey within broader institutional goals rather than personal choices alone. In Washington, the Germany First framework formally prioritized the European theater, but the loss of the Philippines and the threat to Australia required a substantial commitment of naval forces to the Pacific. The United States aimed to prevent further Japanese expansion, protect lines of communication to Australia and New Zealand, and create conditions for an eventual advance toward the Western Pacific, using a combination of carrier raids, submarine warfare, and limited amphibious operations. These objectives relied on shipbuilding programs that were already underway before 1941 and which projected the delivery of additional carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and supply ships throughout 1942 and 1943. Japanese strategy after the initial offensive sought to consolidate a defensive perimeter, stretching from the Aleutians through Midway, the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, Rabaul, and down through the Solomons to the northern approaches to Australia. Within this perimeter, the Imperial Japanese Navy intended to use mobile forces, including Kido Butai and land-based naval air, to inflict losses on any advancing Allied fleet and to win a decisive battle in accordance with pre-war doctrine. Logistically, Japan depended on shipping routes from the Netherlands East Indies, Malaya, and other occupied territories to bring oil, rubber, and other resources to the home islands, leaving convoys and tanker traffic as critical but vulnerable elements of the strategic system. For American naval commanders such as Nimitz, Halsey, Fletcher, and later Spruance, planning revolved around the limited number of fleet carriers available in early 1942. At times, only 3 operational carriers could be concentrated in the Central Pacific, and maintenance schedules, damage, and the need to cover multiple axes of potential Japanese advance forced difficult choices about where to position each task force. Intelligence derived from radio intercepts and traffic analysis provided estimates of Japanese intentions, but these assessments were probabilistic and sometimes contradictory, requiring commanders at sea to make decisions without full clarity about opposing strength and timing. On the Japanese side, planners faced their own constraints. Carrier air groups had gained combat experience in the first months of the war, but the system for training replacement pilots could not quickly generate large numbers of new air crew with comparable skills. Aircraft production and shipbuilding capacity were also limited by industrial output and access to materials. These factors made the preservation of experienced pilots and undamaged carriers a strategic concern, encouraging operations designed to lure the U.S. Pacific Fleet into conditions favorable for a major engagement rather than continuous attrition. Propaganda and public communication influenced planning in both countries. In the United States, the April 1942 raid on Japan was presented to the public as proof that American forces could strike the enemy homeland, reinforcing support for continued mobilization and war bond campaigns. In Japan, early victories in the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies were used to demonstrate the effectiveness of the imperial armed forces and to justify continued sacrifices on the home front, including rationing and expanded industrial labor. These narratives shaped expectations among civilians and soldiers, sometimes making it politically difficult for governments or high commands to adjust plans when new information suggested more cautious approaches. Within this framework, Halsey's carrier task forces were assigned roles that matched their mobility and limited numbers: conduct raids to disrupt Japanese consolidation, cover key lines of communication, and be prepared to support larger fleet actions when opportunities emerged. The fact that different American commanders interpreted the same strategic guidance in varied ways, some emphasizing concentration for decisive battle, others favoring dispersed harassment, illustrated that planning was not a single unified process, but an ongoing negotiation between doctrine, intelligence, logistics, and the personalities of those entrusted with operational command. The first large-scale naval clashes of 1942 tested the carrier doctrines that Halsey and his contemporaries had developed before the war. In early May, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, two American carriers, Lexington and Yorktown, with roughly 128 carrier aircraft, faced the Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, and the light carrier Shoho, with approximately 127 carrier aircraft. Both sides relied on search planes operating over hundreds of kilometers of ocean, attempting to locate enemy task forces without exposing their own positions. The result was the first major naval engagement in which opposing surface ships never sighted each other, with aircraft delivering all significant blows. The Japanese succeeded in sinking Lexington and damaging Yorktown. The Americans sank Shoho and damaged Shokaku. Operationally, Japan won a tactical success in ship losses, but failed to achieve its objective of covering a direct seaborne assault on Port Moresby, which had implications for subsequent operations along the New Guinea-Solomons axis. A month later, in June 1942, the Battle of Midway became a critical early confrontation. American forces deployed 3 fleet carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, with around 233 carrier-based aircraft, plus land-based aircraft on Midway Atoll. The Japanese First Air Fleet brought 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, with roughly 248 embarked aircraft, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Halsey, hospitalized with a severe skin condition, was temporarily replaced at sea by Raymond Spruance, who used Halsey's staff and much of his established operational framework. American codebreakers had provided estimates of Japanese intentions and timing, while Japanese planners assumed that the U.S. Pacific Fleet possessed fewer effective carriers than were actually present. The battle unfolded as successive waves of aircraft from both sides attempted to find and attack enemy carriers. Early American torpedo squadrons suffered high losses without scoring hits, while dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown eventually located the Japanese carriers as their decks were crowded with refueling and rearming aircraft. Within a short period, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were fatally damaged. Later in the day, Hiryu was also hit and lost. Yorktown was disabled by bombs and torpedoes and ultimately sank. Estimated Japanese personnel losses exceeded 3,000, including many experienced pilots and aircrew. American losses were around 300 killed. Midway's small garrison and civilian support staff experienced air attack and bombardment, but remained on the atoll, illustrating how relatively lightly populated islands could become focal points of large fleet actions. These early engagements altered morale and expectations on both sides. In Japan, the outcome at Coral Sea was initially presented as a victory, but the loss of Midway's 4 fleet carriers forced a reassessment of offensive options and contributed to a gradual shift toward a more defensive posture within the existing perimeter. In the United States, the destruction of major Japanese carriers at Midway was interpreted as evidence that the Pacific Fleet could contest sea control despite earlier setbacks. For officers trained in pre-war doctrines, including Halsey, the battles demonstrated both the effectiveness and the vulnerability of carriers. They were capable of decisive strikes, but could themselves be disabled or sunk by a few well-placed bombs or torpedoes. The next phase brought the first major Allied amphibious offensive in the Pacific theater. In August 1942, American Marines, supported by an Allied naval covering force, landed on Guadalcanal and nearby islands in the southern Solomons, seizing an airfield under construction that would become Henderson Field. The landing force numbered roughly 11,000 Marines in the initial wave, opposed by a smaller Japanese construction and security presence that withdrew into the interior. The seizure of the airfield created a new contested zone on the flank of Japanese supply lines to New Guinea. For local Solomon Islanders, the arrival of both Japanese and Allied forces meant the transformation of their environment into a battlefield, with villages exposed to bombardment, airstrikes, and the requisition of resources by both sides. The early naval engagements around Guadalcanal, including the night battle off Savo Island on 9th of August 1942, demonstrated how quickly territorial gains could become precarious. Japanese cruisers and destroyers, using night fighting training and torpedoes, sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers and killed more than 1,000 sailors in a few hours, while suffering comparatively limited damage to their own ships. The abrupt withdrawal of covering carriers left the Marines on Guadalcanal with reduced naval support and highlighted tensions within Allied command over risk tolerance for capital ships. Halsey, who would soon assume broader command responsibilities in the South Pacific, inherited a situation in which early clashes had created both opportunities and vulnerabilities, setting the conditions for a prolonged struggle over a single island and its airfield. Escalation in the southern Solomons turned Guadalcanal into a prolonged crisis for both coalitions. On the 18th of October, 1942, Halsey was appointed Commander South Pacific Area and South Pacific Forces, responsible for naval, ground, and air operations from New Caledonia to the southern Solomons. He took over from Vice Admiral Robert Gormley at a time when approximately 23,000 American troops were on Guadalcanal and nearby islands, supported by a fluctuating force of cruisers, destroyers, and 1 or 2 carriers, while Japanese forces committed more than 30,000 soldiers and Marines over the course of the campaign, moving many of them by destroyer at night, along what Allied crews called the Tokyo Express. Command challenges were immediate. American supply lines ran more than 1,000 kilometers from rear bases at Noumea and Espiritu Santo, with limited transport shipping and frequent air and submarine threats. Japanese convoys had shorter routes from Rabaul and the northern Solomons, but faced growing interdiction by aircraft from Henderson Field and by Allied submarines. Fuel, ammunition, and food shortages appeared on both sides. Japanese troops inland on Guadalcanal often received reduced rations and suffered high rates of disease, while American units on the island experienced temporary shortages of artillery ammunition and aviation fuel during periods when bad weather or enemy action drove supply ships away. Naval battles intensified as each side sought to influence the ground struggle through control of the surrounding seas. In late August and again in September 1942, carrier clashes at the eastern Solomons and off Cape Esperance cost both navies ships and aircraft. By late October, at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, the American carrier Enterprise and the damaged Hornet, with about 136 carrier aircraft, faced the Japanese carriers Shokaku, Zuikaku, and the light carrier Zuiho, with roughly 199 aircraft. Hornet was sunk and Enterprise heavily damaged. Japanese carriers survived, but lost a significant number of experienced aircrew. These engagements left both navies with reduced carrier strength, just as land fighting on Guadalcanal reached its peak. On the island itself, October brought large-scale Japanese attempts to retake Henderson Field. Ground assaults by elements of the 2nd Division and other units, numbering more than 20,000 men over multiple attacks, were supported by night bombardments from Japanese battleships and cruisers. American defenders, including Marine and later Army regiments with integrated artillery and air support, repulsed these attacks at heavy cost on both sides. Solomon Islanders, whose villages and gardens lay near lines of advance and supply routes, were drawn into the conflict as guides, coast watchers' assistants, and providers of local intelligence. They also bore the impact of displacement, property damage, and exposure to disease in areas where medical services were limited. The crisis reached a new level in November, with the series of engagements known collectively as the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. Between the 12th and 15th of November 1942, Repeated clashes between American and Japanese surface forces involved at various points 2 Japanese battleships, multiple cruisers and destroyers, and roughly comparable American formations. In the initial night battle on November 13th, both sides lost cruisers and destroyers, and Japanese battleship Hiei was later sunk. A subsequent engagement on November 15th saw the battleship Kirishima destroyed by gunfire from the American battleships Washington and South Dakota. Transport losses were severe. Several Japanese troopships bringing reinforcements and supplies were sunk or beached with most cargo lost, while American ships covering the operations also suffered heavy damage and casualties. Politically and militarily, these weeks represented a test of endurance. Japanese leaders weighed the costs of continuing major reinforcement of Guadalcanal against commitments in New Guinea and other theaters. American authorities balanced the need to support the island against global demands, including preparations for operations in North Africa and the Atlantic. Halsey's headquarters coordinated naval cover, air support, and reinforcement convoys under conditions of uncertain intelligence, limited reserves, and constant risk, while local commanders on sea and land interpreted orders according to rapidly changing tactical realities, creating a complex, multi-level crisis that none of the participants could fully control. By early 1943, the struggle in the Southern Solomons reached its most intense phase, even as its character began to shift. Japanese leaders, after repeated failed attempts to recapture Henderson Field, and in the face of mounting losses at sea and in the air, decided to withdraw their remaining forces from Guadalcanal under the cover of night destroyer runs. Between 1 and 7 February 1943, destroyer groups evacuated roughly 10,000 Japanese troops in what Allied intelligence initially misinterpreted as another reinforcement effort. American ground units, numbering about 50,000 Marines and Army personnel across the island by this stage, advanced cautiously through jungle terrain, discovering abandoned positions, equipment, and graves rather than prepared defenses. For Japanese soldiers removed from the island, the evacuation represented survival, but also the loss of months of effort. For American troops and Solomon Islanders, it marked the end of one destructive phase, but not of the wider campaign. With Guadalcanal secured, Halsey's South Pacific Command turned toward the central and northern Solomons. The next objective was New Georgia, particularly the Japanese airfield at Munda, which supported operations across the region. In June 1943, approximately 30,000 American troops, including Army and Marine units, began landings on New Georgia, Rendova, and nearby islands. Japanese forces in the New Georgia group, including elements of the 8th Area Army and Naval Infantry, eventually totaled around 21,000 personnel. Fighting took place in dense jungle, swamps, and coastal mangroves, where visibility was limited and movement slow. Disease and logistical difficulties affected both sides, with malaria, dysentery, and supply shortages reducing combat effectiveness as much as direct enemy fire. Naval engagements continued in the narrow waters north of Guadalcanal and around New Georgia. In July 1943, night battles in Leyte Gulf and at Columbangara involved groups of cruisers and destroyers on both sides. In Leyte Gulf, U.S. forces lost the light cruiser Helena and more than 160 sailors, while Japanese ships suffered damage and transport losses but continued to move troops. At Columbangara, U.S. and Allied cruisers damaged the Japanese light cruiser Jinsu, which later sank. Yet Japanese destroyers succeeded in landing additional soldiers. These battles showed that even after losing Guadalcanal, Japanese surface forces could inflict significant casualties, while Allied commanders had to weigh the value of intercepting reinforcement runs against the risks to their own already limited cruisers and destroyers. Air operations reached a new scale. From Henderson Field and other advanced bases, Allied air units flew daily missions against Japanese airfields, shipping, and supply routes. Combined Allied air strength in the South Pacific rose into the hundreds of aircraft, including fighters, dive bombers, and medium bombers, while Japanese naval and Army air units sought to contest control with their own fighters and bombers based at Buin, Kahili, and Rabaul. Both sides incurred continuous losses in machines and personnel. For pilots and ground crews, the peak of the campaign meant high sortie rates. rapid turnarounds, and frequent exposure to combat or air raids, often while operating from airstrips constructed on coral or cleared jungle with limited infrastructure. The culmination of the Solomons campaign came with operations against Bougainville and the neutralization of Rabaul. In November 1943, about 14,000 U.S. Marines from the 3rd Marine Division and supporting Army units landed at Cape Torrequina on Bougainville, establishing a perimeter intended primarily to host airfields rather than to occupy the entire island. Japanese forces on Bougainville and nearby islands numbered roughly 65,000, including Army units and naval personnel, but many were positioned farther north and east. Naval forces under Halsey covered the landings, and on the night of the 1st to the 2nd of November, during the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay, American cruisers and destroyers engaged Japanese force attempting to attack the landing area. Both sides suffered ship damage and casualties, but the landing beaches remained under Allied control. As airfields on Bougainville became operational, Allied bombers and fighters joined with land-based aircraft from other areas to conduct repeated strikes against Rabaul, one of Japan's main forward bases in the Southwest Pacific, which housed significant air, naval, and logistical installations. Rather than assaulting Rabaul directly with ground forces, Allied strategy under Halsey in the South Pacific and under Douglas MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific aimed to isolate it by capturing surrounding positions and cutting supply lines. Japanese personnel at Rabaul, estimated at over 100,000 Army and Navy troops combined, remained in place but faced increasing shortages of fuel and freedom of movement as Allied air power made large-scale sorties risky. For local New Guinean and New Britain communities, the peak of these operations brought frequent bombardment, dislocation, and the long-term presence of garrisons whose ability to procure food and supplies from the surrounding countryside increasingly affected civilian livelihoods. The transition from the Solomons to the Central Pacific in 1944 required both sides to adapt to a different scale of operations. In February 1944, Halsey turned over the South Pacific to his successor and later assumed command of the Third Fleet, a formation built around fast carriers and their escorts. The same ships, when under Raymond Spruance's operational control, were designated the Fifth Fleet, illustrating an institutional adaptation. Alternating commanders and staffs used a common pool of vessels, allowing one staff to plan while the other fought. For crews on board, the designation changed, but the daily reality remained the management of long deployments, maintenance cycles, and preparation for increasingly distant strikes. On the American side, resistance to Japanese positions took the form of a methodical advance across the Central Pacific. The Fast Carrier Force, eventually known as Task Force 58 under Spruance and Task Force 38 under Halsey, could field more than a dozen fleet and light carriers at peak strength, with over 900 carrier aircraft, supported by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and a growing train of oilers, ammunition ships, and repair vessels. To sustain this force, the U.S. Navy refined underway replenishment techniques, transferring fuel, bombs, and provisions at sea so that task groups could remain on station for extended periods. This logistical system represented a major adaptation from earlier campaigns, reducing dependence on fixed bases and allowing rapid shifts of concentration across thousands of kilometers. Japanese planners, facing the loss or isolation of outlying bases such as Rabaul and the reduction of available carriers and trained aircrew, adjusted their defensive concept. Rather than contesting every island, they prepared selected positions for protracted resistance, constructing underground facilities, dispersing aircraft, and integrating Army and Navy air units. Fuel shortages forced limits on training hours and sortie rates. Some air groups relied on simulators and classroom instruction to compensate for reduced flying time. At sea, surface forces were increasingly held back for scenarios in which a large, decisive engagement might be fought closer to the Philippines or the home islands, while submarines attempted to interdict Allied logistics. For Halsey's future command, these changes meant that resistance would not only take place at the shoreline, but also in the form of dispersed air and submarine attacks against the support structure of the Fast Carrier Force. American escorts developed more systematic anti-submarine screens, using radar, sonar, and coordinated air patrols from escort carriers. Destroyer and destroyer escort crews conducted constant searches and depth charge attacks, while merchant and auxiliary ships adopted zigzag courses and blackout procedures. The adaptation was mutual. As Allied defenses improved, Japanese submarines experimented with night surface approaches and coordinated attacks on convoys supplying the forward bases that enabled carrier operations. Psychological adaptation also became necessary. Long voyages, frequent combat sorties, and news from Europe and the home front affected morale among sailors and airmen. The U.S. Navy established rest and recreation centers in places such as Hawaii, New Caledonia, and later Ulithi, where personnel could leave their ships temporarily between operations. Rotation policies aimed to move experienced pilots out of frontline squadrons after a certain number of missions, both to preserve their lives and to use them as instructors. Japanese forces, with fewer opportunities to withdraw experienced crews from combat and under increasing material strain, found it more difficult to implement similar systems. Some pilots and ship crews served through repeated campaigns with limited rest, influencing performance and attitudes toward risk. On land, resistance to the advancing fleets included the strengthening of garrisons in the Marianas, Carolines, and the Philippines. Civilian populations on these islands experienced intensified military construction, conscription for labor, and restrictions on movement as both sides anticipated future battles. Airfields, underground storage, and coastal batteries were expanded using forced labor and local resources. In American-held areas, islanders and colonial subjects worked for Allied forces as laborers, scouts, and support staff, their daily routines shaped by the logistical needs of bases that hosted thousands of troops and large concentrations of aircraft and ships. By the time Halsey formally took command of the Third Fleet in mid-1944, the Pacific War had become a contest of adapted systems rather than isolated engagements. Japanese resistance relied on conserving remaining carriers, concentrating land-based air at key points, and using geography to offset numerical disadvantages. American adaptation centered on mass production, rotating command structures, and a mobile logistic network designed to support continuous operations. How these competing approaches would interact in the waters around the Marianas and the Philippines would determine whether resistance could delay or redirect the next stage of the campaign. The decisive shift in Halsey's wartime career came in the autumn of 1944, when American forces moved to retake the Philippines, and Japanese naval strategy focused on one last major effort to challenge control of the sea. In October 1944, U.S. ground forces landed on Leyte with an initial assault force of around 132,000 troops, supported by hundreds of ships ranging from battleships and cruisers to transports and landing craft. The operation aimed to cut Japan's communications with the Netherlands, East Indies, and Malaya, severing access to oil and raw materials that were essential for continued resistance. Japanese forces on the archipelago included multiple army divisions, air units, and garrisons spread across Luzon, Leyte, Samar, and other islands, totaling several 100,000 personnel who would become increasingly isolated as the campaign progressed. For the Leyte operation, the U.S. Navy deployed a complex command structure. The Third Fleet under Halsey, designated as Task Force 38, provided fast carrier support, while the Seventh Fleet under Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid, operating under General Douglas MacArthur's overall authority, covered the landings and provided close naval gunfire and escort protection. Third Fleet's fast carriers and escorts were organized into several task groups, each with multiple fleet and light carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, capable of independent operation but coordinated through centralized orders. Seventh Fleet's forces included older battleships, escort carriers, and amphibious shipping concentrated near the landing beaches. Japanese command divided its response into three main naval forces: a powerful central force with battleships and cruisers approaching from the west through the Sibuyan Sea, a southern group advancing through Surigao Strait, and a northern group composed largely of carriers, with relatively few aircraft acting as a decoy to draw American fast carriers away from Leyte. The opening stages of the battle around Leyte showed how air and sea power intersected with land operations. Carrier aircraft from Halsey's task groups struck Japanese airfields across Luzon and other islands to reduce the threat of land-based aircraft, while also attacking elements of the approaching Japanese fleets. In the Sibuyan Sea, repeated airstrikes damaged several Japanese ships, including hits on the battleship Musashi. Japanese pilots, operating from land bases and from the reduced carrier force, conducted raids against American carriers, escort carriers, and transports, sometimes breaking through fighter screens and anti-aircraft fire to score hits. Civilians on Leyte and neighboring islands experienced bombing, shelling, and ground combat as villages near airfields or road junctions became contested zones. Many moved into hills or more remote areas, while others were drawn into labor for both Japanese and American forces as the campaign developed. During 23rd to 25th October 1944, decisions about the disposition of the fast carrier groups became central. Halsey concentrated Task Force 38 against the Northern Japanese Carrier Group, interpreting it as the principal remaining threat, and an opportunity to eliminate the last significant Japanese carrier formation. The fast carriers and accompanying battleships moved north, engaging and sinking several Japanese carriers in a series of air and surface actions that removed much of Japan's remaining carrier tonnage from the war. At the same time, the Japanese Central Force, which had been thought to be withdrawing after earlier air attacks, passed through the San Bernardino Strait and emerged off the island of Samar, where it engaged escort carriers and destroyers of 7th Fleet's Task Unit 77.4.3. The resulting action saw smaller American ships launching torpedo and gun attacks against battleships and cruisers to cover the escort carriers' withdrawal, while aircraft with limited ordnance made repeated strikes to slow the advance. The convergence of these movements created a turning point with multiple dimensions. Operationally, the battles in and around the Surigao Strait and off Samar inflicted such losses on Japanese surface forces that organized large-scale sorties by the Imperial Japanese Navy became rare thereafter. In Surigao Strait, older American battleships and support ships engaged the southern Japanese force in a classic line-of-battle action, contributing to the sinking of several enemy vessels and blocking access to the landing area from the south. Off Samar, the Japanese Central Force, despite numerical and firepower advantages, broke off its action and retired, influenced by damage received, concerns about air attack, and uncertainty about the location of the fast carriers. Strategically, Japanese naval capacity to challenge American sea control was sharply reduced, even as significant numbers of Japanese ground troops remained active in the Philippines and elsewhere. For those on the receiving end of these decisions, the consequences were immediate. American sailors on escort carriers and destroyers off Samar faced heavy shelling and air attack, with several ships sunk and hundreds of casualties. Japanese sailors on battleships and cruisers experienced concentrated airstrikes that disabled or sank multiple ships, while survivors from damaged vessels often awaited rescue in seas contested by aircraft and submarines. Filipino civilians on Leyte, Samar, and later Luzon navigated between advancing American forces and retreating Japanese units, encountering requisitions, forced labor, and in some areas local reprisals as control shifted. The turning point at Leyte thus combined the destruction of much of Japan's remaining fleet with the beginning of a long, costly ground campaign in the archipelago, one in which Halsey's carrier forces played a central but not exclusive role among many interacting military and civilian actors. The final phase of Halsey's wartime command unfolded as Japan's ability to sustain large-scale naval operations declined, but its ground forces and civilian population remained engaged in the conflict. After Leyte, carrier groups under the alternating designations of 3rd Fleet, Halsey, and 5th Fleet, Spruance, supported continuing operations in the Philippines, including landings on Mindoro and Luzon, by striking airfields, shipping, and troop concentrations across the archipelago and along the China coast. Japanese Army and Navy units, often operating with reduced resupply, continued to fight on multiple islands. Guerrilla organizations, some of which had maintained activity since 1942, cooperated with American and Filipino forces in intelligence gathering and local operations. For rural communities, the overlap of regular troops, guerrillas, and shifting front lines meant ongoing requisitions, forced labor, and exposure to air and artillery bombardment. As ground campaigns advanced, Halsey's fleet moved closer to Japan's home waters. In early 1945, fast carriers supported operations at Iwo Jima and later Okinawa by attacking Japanese airfields on Kyushu, Shikoku, and Honshu, as well as shipping in the inland sea. The Okinawa campaign, which began with landings by more than 180,000 U.S. ground troops and confronted Japanese forces numbering over 100,000 soldiers and auxiliaries, became one of the longest and most costly battles in the Pacific. Carrier and land-based aircraft flew thousands of sorties against fortifications, supply routes, and kamikaze staging areas. Japanese special attack units launched hundreds of aircraft against Allied ships around Okinawa, sinking and damaging numerous vessels and causing significant casualties among sailors and Marines. Okinawan civilians, estimated in the hundreds of thousands, were caught between advancing American units and defended Japanese positions, facing bombardment, displacement, and in many cases coercion from both sides as each sought to control territory and information. At sea, the fleet under Halsey's and Spruance's alternating commands endured not only enemy action, but also severe weather. In December 1944, and again in mid-1945, powerful typhoons struck the operating areas of the fast carrier groups and their support ships. High winds and heavy seas capsized destroyers, damaged carriers and other vessels, and swept aircraft from flight and hangar decks. These incidents highlighted the vulnerability of even large modern fleets to environmental conditions and raised questions within the U.S. Navy about weather forecasting, formation handling in storms, and the balance between maintaining offensive pressure and minimizing non-combat losses. For officers and enlisted personnel, the typhoons represented a different form of risk that could not be attributed to enemy action, yet had direct implications for survival and operational readiness. By the summer of 1945, Japan's strategic position had deteriorated further. Submarine campaigns and mining operations had sharply reduced the flow of oil and raw materials to the home islands. Urban and industrial areas were subjected to extensive bombing by land-based aircraft, while the remaining elements of the Imperial Japanese Navy were mostly confined to port or coastal waters with limited fuel. Halsey's Third Fleet participated in the final series of strikes against targets on Honshu and Hokkaido, including shipyards, transportation hubs, and remaining naval units. For Japanese civilians in these areas, the late war air and naval attacks brought repeated air raid alerts, destruction of housing and infrastructure, and disruptions to food distribution systems already strained by the loss of maritime imports and internal transport difficulties. The end of organized Japanese resistance came after a sequence of events that included the continued bombing of Japanese cities, the use of new weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Soviet entry into the war against Japan, with operations in Manchuria and other regions. Following the imperial decision to accept Allied terms, ceasefire instructions were transmitted to units across Japan's remaining holdings. At sea, Third Fleet and other Allied naval forces shifted from combat operations to tasks associated with the transition, enforcing the cessation of hostilities, monitoring compliance with surrender terms, and preparing for occupation landings. Some Japanese ships sailed under orders to concentrate at designated ports, while others remained where they were until Allied representatives could inspect and disarm them. Naval personnel on both sides adjusted rapidly from patterns of engagement to new routines involving supervision, documentation, and humanitarian tasks such as evacuation and medical aid. For Halsey, the withdrawal from combat took the form of escorting occupation forces and overseeing aspects of the initial post-war presence in Japanese waters. American ships entered ports that had been targets of earlier operations, while Japanese naval bases and dockyards were inspected, disarmed, or repurposed under Allied supervision. The fleet that had conducted mobile operations across vast distances now spent extended periods at anchor, serving as a visible symbol of the new power balance and as a logistical platform for the movement of occupation troops and supplies. Japanese military personnel, many of whom had expected prolonged fighting on or near the home islands, transitioned to disarmament, demobilization, and eventual repatriation from outlying territories. For civilians, the presence of large Allied naval formations near major ports signaled not only the end of bombing and blockade, but also the beginning of a new period of political and economic uncertainty in which pre-war institutions, including the role of the armed forces, would be redefined. In the years after the war, assessments of Halsey's role formed part of a wider reconsideration of how the Pacific Campaign had been fought. Official U.S. Navy histories highlighted his contributions to the early carrier raids, the Solomons Campaign, and the offensive use of fast carriers in support of large amphibious operations. Command changes between 3rd Fleet under Halsey and 5th Fleet under Spruance were presented as complementary, with one staff planning while the other operated. Within this framework, Halsey appeared as one of several senior commanders whose decisions collectively produced a sustained advance across the Pacific, rather than as a single dominant figure. At the same time, specific episodes generated debate. The decision at Leyte to move the fast carriers north against the Japanese decoy force left escort carriers and destroyers off Samar, exposed to a powerful surface fleet. Some veterans and analysts later argued that closer coordination between 3rd and 7th Fleets might have reduced the risk to those units, while others emphasized that the destruction of the Japanese carrier group removed a long-term threat and that incomplete information shaped choices at the time. The typhoon losses of 1944 and 1945 likewise entered professional discussions as case studies in command responsibility, weather forecasting, and fleet handling, leading to revised procedures intended to prevent similar non-combat losses. Japanese perspectives on Halsey and the fast carrier forces often focus less on individuals and more on systems. Former officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy described the impact of continuous carrier and land-based airstrikes on fuel stocks, training programs, and the ability to move ships and aircraft between fronts. For them, 3rd Fleet and its counterparts represented an integrated striking and logistic structure that Japan could not match in the long term. At the same time, memoirs and post-war studies by Japanese participants in battles such as Guadalcanal, the Solomons, and Leyte recorded the determination of units that continued to operate under increasingly severe shortages, emphasizing local initiative and the high costs incurred on both sides. On the Allied side, veterans of the U.S. Navy, Marine Corps, Army, Royal Australian Navy, and other forces remembered Halsey as one among several senior leaders whose orders framed their experience. Sailors and airmen who served in his task forces recounted long periods at sea, frequent combat, and the practical consequences of operational decisions, from high sortie rates to exposure to typhoons. Ground troops on Guadalcanal, New Georgia, Bougainville, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa experienced carrier operations indirectly through naval gunfire support and air cover, noting both the protection and the limits of what distant fleets could provide in difficult terrain and weather. Civilians across the Pacific and East Asia encountered Halsey's command primarily through the effects of naval and air operations. Residents of island groups that hosted airfields or anchorages, such as the Solomons, the Marianas, and parts of the Philippines, saw their homes converted into logistical hubs, with accompanying employment, displacement, and environmental change. Japanese and Okinawan civilians on the home islands experienced late war strikes by fast carriers as part of a broader pattern of air raids and blockade that disrupted transport and food supplies. In the post-war period, these experiences entered local and national narratives, influencing how different societies remembered the same operations, as liberation, occupation, devastation, or a combination of all three. Institutionally, Halsey's wartime record influenced post-war doctrinal development. The fast carrier task force model, refined under both Halsey and Spruance, became a foundation for U.S. naval strategy in the early Cold War, when carriers were adapted to deliver jet aircraft and, later, nuclear-capable systems. War colleges and staff courses used Leyte, the Solomons, and the Typhoon episodes as teaching tools for examining command relationships, risk, intelligence, and logistic planning. Discussions rarely produced unanimous verdicts, but instead highlighted how similar information could lead different commanders to divergent yet defensible choices. Halsey himself was promoted to Fleet Admiral in 1945 and retired from active service in 1947. In public memory, particularly in the United States, he appeared in films, biographies, and commemorative events as one of the prominent naval leaders of the Second World War. Monuments, ship namings, and museum exhibits presented his career alongside those of other admirals, emphasizing operational milestones rather than internal debates. In Japan, the Philippines, and various Pacific islands, commemoration took different forms, often centered on local cemeteries, historical markers, and community narratives that framed the same campaigns in terms of loss, survival, and social change. Over time, historians integrated these multiple strands into broader analyses of the Pacific War. Works comparing command styles contrasted Halsey's readiness to employ fast carriers offensively with more conservative or differently structured approaches, while also noting that all major commanders operated under political, logistic, and informational constraints. Studies of civilians and the environment place naval operations within wider patterns of displacement, resource extraction, and post-war reconstruction. In this context, Halsey's legacy is interpreted less as a single story of an individual and more as one component in a complex system of decisions, institutions, and experiences that collectively shaped how the Pacific War was fought and how it has been remembered in different societies.